The awakening. John Carter's eyes snapped open to complete darkness. His head throbbed like someone had used it for target practice, and his body felt like he'd been sleeping on concrete for a week. The metallic taste in his mouth and the strange, sulfurous smell in the air told him immediately that wherever he was, it wasn't Kansas. Cold stone pressed against his back as he slowly sat up, his military training automatically kicking in. Assess. Adapt. Survive. The mantra that had kept him alive through 3 tours in Afghanistan and countless Black Ops missions now echoed in his mind. As his vision adjusted to the dim blue glow emanating from the ceiling, John's breath caught in his throat. He was in a massive stone chamber that stretched up at least 50 feet, with smooth walls that offered no handholds or hiding spots. One enormous metallic door dominated the far wall, and strange blue lights pulsed overhead like mechanical stars. But it wasn't the alien architecture that made his blood run cold. It was the 3 massive shapes stirring in the shadows. The first creature to move was easily the size of a city bus, with scales that gleamed like burnished copper in the ethereal light. As it unfurled wings that nearly spanned the width of the cell, John's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. A dragon. An actual, living, breathing dragon. Well, a voice rumbled like distant thunder, this is unexpected. John's hand instinctively reached for his sidearm, finding only the rough fabric of a gray jumpsuit. No weapons, no gear, no comm device. Just him and 3 dragons in what appeared to be the galaxy's most exclusive prison cell. The copper dragon's massive head turned toward him, eyes glowing with ancient intelligence. Human, it said, and somehow John understood despite knowing the creature wasn't speaking English. I am Vermithrax. The blue one is Saphra, and the gray one is Draxus. Saphra, her scales shimmering like liquid sapphires, moved closer with surprising grace. The collectors have outdone themselves this time. A human in a predator cell. How amusing. Amusing. Draxus, the smallest of the 3 but still the size of a fighter jet, snorted a puff of smoke. They've basically delivered us lunch. John stood slowly, keeping his movements calm despite every instinct screaming at him to run. There was nowhere to go anyway, and showing fear would only make him look like prey. Where am I? He asked, his voice steady despite the surreal situation. The collection, Vermithrax replied, settling back on his haunches like a cat preparing to pounce. We are specimens, human. Captured from our respective worlds by beings who consider themselves scientists. Collectors, Saphra added, her voice softer but no less dangerous. They travel between worlds, taking samples of interesting species. We've been here for many moon cycles. John's eyes tracked upward to the blue lights on the ceiling, noting the small devices that seemed to follow his movements. We're being watched. Always, Draxus confirmed. They rarely show themselves, but they observe constantly. Waiting to see how different species interact. The implication hung in the air like smoke. John had been thrown into a cage with 3 apex predators, and somewhere, alien scientists were taking notes on how long he'd survive. A section of the wall suddenly slid open with a soft hum, revealing a smaller chamber filled with containers of food and water. The dragons moved toward it in a precise order, Vermithrax first, then Saphra, then Draxus. Hierarchy, John noted. Important information. After the dragons had eaten their fill of some kind of raw meat, John approached cautiously. A separate container held what appeared to be human rations and clean water. Different food for different species. The collectors were thorough, he had to give them that. As he ate, John studied his cellmates more carefully. Each dragon wore a metallic collar around their neck that pulsed with the same blue light as the ceiling monitors. Control devices, Vermithrax explained, noticing his gaze. They suppress our natural abilities. No fire, no magic, just claws and teeth. But no collar for you, Saphra observed, her head tilting. They don't consider you dangerous enough. John smiled grimly as he settled against the wall for what he assumed would be night when the lights dimmed. Their mistake. As the dragons settled into their respective corners, filling the chamber with the sound of scales against stone, John began to plan. He'd been in impossible situations before, captured behind enemy lines, outnumbered and outgunned. But he'd always found a way out. This time wouldn't be different. The collectors thought they were studying specimens, but they were about to learn why putting a human special forces operative in a cage was never a good idea. Even if that cage happened to contain 3 dragons. Understanding the enemy. John had been awake for 3 hours when the collectors made their first appearance. The massive door slid open with a whisper, and 5 gray-skinned beings entered. They stood about 4 feet tall, with disproportionately large heads and black eyes that seemed to absorb light. Each carried a tablet-like device strapped to their thin arms. He forced himself to remain still, breathing slowly as if asleep, while observing everything through barely opened eyes. The aliens moved with clinical precision, pointing at different areas of the cell and making soft clicking sounds to each other. When one pointed directly at him, John caught the unmistakable tone of surprise in their alien chatter. They hadn't expected him to survive the night. After the collectors left, Vermithrax approached him. "You learn quickly, human. Most species either cower in terror or make foolish attempts at communication during their first encounter." "I'm not most species," John replied, standing and stretching muscles that had stiffened from sleeping on stone. "How often do they visit?" "Twice daily," Safra answered from across the cell. "Morning and evening observations. Sometimes they bring new equipment or change the food distribution." John nodded, filing the information away. Routine was good. Routine could be exploited. Over the next few days, John established his own routine. He explored every inch of the cell within reach, testing the walls for weak points and studying the ventilation system. He exercised using military calisthenics, maintaining his strength and flexibility. Most importantly, he watched. He watched the dragons, learning their individual personalities and behavioral patterns. Vermithrax was the alpha, intelligent and calculating. Safra was cautious but observant, often the first to notice changes in their environment. Draxus was the most aggressive, quick to anger but also the most likely to act without thinking. He watched the collectors during their visits, noting their technology, their communication methods, and their obvious fear of the dragons even with the control collars in place. The aliens kept their distance, never entering the cell proper, always maintaining a clear path to the exit. And he watched the cell itself, memorizing every detail of their prison. The door mechanism, the feeding system, the monitoring devices, the subtle energy fluctuations that preceded each automated function. "You are strange for a human," Safra commented one day as John completed his 100th push-up. The blue dragon had been watching him with growing curiosity. "How many humans have you known?" John asked, not breaking his rhythm. "Stories," she replied. "Tales from worlds where your kind exists. Humans are said to be emotional, unpredictable, quick to panic." "Some are," John agreed, switching to one-handed push-ups. "I was trained not to be." Draxus, who had been listening from nearby, snorted derisively. "Trained like a pet." John's eyes hardened, but his voice remained calm. "Trained as a warrior. A soldier. Someone who fights." The 3 dragons exchanged glances, amusement evident in their expressions. They still saw him as harmless, a curiosity rather than a threat. John was fine with that assessment. Better to be underestimated. On the 7th day, everything changed. The massive door opened completely for the first time since John's arrival. The collectors entered with their usual equipment, but behind them came something that made even Vermithrax tense with wariness. Another dragon. This one was larger than the others, with scales so black they seemed to absorb the blue light from the ceiling. It entered the cell with predatory grace, eyes scanning everything before fixing on John with unmistakable hunger. "Gulthex," Vermithrax growled, a sound that vibrated through the stone floor. "They brought him here." The black dragon's laugh was like grinding metal. They gave us a snack, he said, his voice colder than the others. Such a tiny thing. I could swallow you in one bite, human. John stood his ground as Golthex approached, every instinct screaming at him to move. But there was nowhere to run, and showing fear would only make him look like prey. You could try, John said quietly. Golthex stopped, surprised by the response. Dragons were used to causing fear in smaller creatures. This human should be trembling, begging for mercy. Instead, he stood firm, his eyes calculating. I like this one, Golthex said after a moment. It has spirit. The collectors put him here for a reason, Vermithrax warned, moving forward slightly. We should wait and see what they want. Always so cautious, Vermithrax, Golthex replied. Maybe they put him here for our entertainment. As the dragons discussed his fate, John used the opportunity to assess the new threat. Golthex was powerful, but also recently captured based on the way he moved, like someone still adjusting to the weight of his control collar. The black dragon was dangerous, but also potentially useful. The feeding wall opened again, but this time something new appeared alongside the usual provisions. A long metal rod with a curved end, about 3 feet in length. The dragons looked confused, but John understood immediately. The collectors were introducing new variables to their experiment. Tools. Potential weapons. While Golthex dominated the feeding area, shoving past Draxus and claiming the largest portion of meat, John quietly retrieved the metal rod. He tested its weight and balance, noting its alien construction but familiar function. It would do. That night, as the dragons settled into uneasy sleep with their new cellmate claiming the center of the chamber, John worked in silence. He tore strips from the bottom of his jumpsuit and wrapped them around one end of the rod to create a grip. He tested the curved end against the stone floor, sharpening it slightly. The collectors thought they were observing specimens in a controlled environment. But they had made a critical error in their experiment design. They had given a human special forces operative a weapon. And John Carter was about to show them exactly why that was a very, very bad idea. The plan forms. The next morning brought more collectors than John had ever seen. At least a dozen of the gray-skinned aliens crowded near the door, their large black eyes blinking rapidly as they made notes on their devices. Their excitement was palpable, and John understood why. They were waiting for him to die. Golthex had grown increasingly agitated under their observation. The black dragon reared up suddenly, stretching to his full impressive height and releasing a roar that would have shattered windows if there had been any. The collectors stepped back in alarm, but continued watching. John filed this reaction away. The aliens feared the dragons, even with their control collars. Fear was a weakness he could exploit. Over the following days, tension in the cell grew thick enough to cut. Golthex dominated the space, forcing the other dragons to the edges and claiming the best sleeping spots. But more importantly to John, the black dragon's presence had disrupted the established hierarchy. He grows bolder each day, Saphra whispered to John during one of the rare moments when Golthex was sleeping. Without the collar's full restrictions, he would have already challenged Vermithrax for leadership. What happens if he does? John asked quietly. Dragon politics, Vermithrax answered grimly. Territory disputes. Bloodshed. In the wild, it would be settled quickly. Here. He gestured to the confined space with one massive claw. Here it becomes a prolonged torment. John nodded, understanding more than the dragons realized. Confined spaces, alpha personalities, limited resources. He'd seen the same dynamics in military prisons and POW camps. Pressure built until something explosive happened. But pressure could also be channeled. That evening, as the feeding wall opened to reveal reduced rations, another variable the collectors had introduced, John made his move. The food's getting smaller, he observed loudly, ensuring all the dragons could hear. They're reducing our portions. Golthex immediately moved toward the feeding area, shouldering past Draxus. More for me then, little human. Is it though? John continued, his voice carrying clearly in the stone chamber. Or are they testing something else? Vermithrax's intelligent eyes fixed on John. What do you mean? Think about it, John said, retrieving his own meager rations while staying well clear of the dragon's territorial disputes. They capture apex predators from different worlds and put them together. They watch us constantly. They introduce new variables. He gestured subtly to the metal rod hidden beside his sleeping area, and now they're creating scarcity. Safra's head tilted thoughtfully. They want to see how we respond to resource competition. Exactly. They're not just observing natural behavior anymore. They're manufacturing conflict. Draxus snarled, his gray scales bristling. Let them watch. When this collar stops working properly, I'll show them conflict. Will you? John asked quietly. Or will you just give them exactly what they want? The question hung in the air like smoke. For the first time since his arrival, John had the complete attention of all four dragons. They expect us to fight, he continued. They expect territory disputes, dominance displays, maybe some bloodshed. They probably have bets running on which dragon kills the human first. Gulfex laughed, but there was less certainty in it than before. And what would you have us do instead, little warrior? John stood slowly, meeting the black dragon's gaze without flinching. I'd have you ask yourselves why they haven't separated us. Why they put natural enemies together and then act surprised when we don't immediately tear each other apart. Because they're studying social dynamics, Vermithrax said slowly, his voice thoughtful. Right. But what if we're not the subjects of their experiment? John paused, letting the question sink in. What if we're the experiment itself? Safra's eyes widened. You think they're testing their containment methods? I think they're perfecting them, John confirmed. Different species, different abilities, different psychology. We're a stress test for their prison systems. The dragons exchanged glances, and John could see the wheels turning in their ancient minds. They were predators, but they were also intelligent enough to recognize when they were being hunted. So what do you propose? Draxus asked, his aggressive posture shifting to something more thoughtful. John smiled grimly. I propose we stop giving them what they want and start giving them what they don't expect. Over the next few days, John began implementing his plan. Instead of competing for resources, the cell's inhabitants began cooperating. When Gulfex tried to dominate the feeding area, the others simply waited, refusing to engage in the territorial display the collectors clearly expected. John shared his observations about the aliens' technology, pointing out weaknesses he'd noticed in their surveillance system and energy patterns in the door mechanism. The dragons, in turn, shared their knowledge of the collectors' routines and behavioral patterns. They fear us, Vermithrax observed during one of their planning sessions. Even with the collars, they maintain distance. Fear can be used, John replied, testing the edge of his improvised weapon. But timing is everything. Safra moved closer, her massive head lowering to John's level. You have a plan. I have the beginning of one, John confirmed. But it requires all of us working together. Gulfex snorted, but with less disdain than usual. A human leading dragons. The collectors would find that amusing. They won't be laughing for long, John said quietly. Because what they don't understand about humans is that we don't just survive impossible situations. He looked up at each of the massive creatures surrounding him, seeing not monsters but potential allies in a fight for freedom. We make them impossible for everyone else. The collectors continued their observations, taking notes on the unusual cooperation between species that should have been at each other's throats. They increased their visits, bringing new equipment and additional personnel. They were excited by the unexpected data, convinced they were witnessing groundbreaking behavioral adaptation. They had no idea they were actually watching the formation of the most dangerous alliance their collection had ever contained. The Great Escape. 2 weeks after Gulfex's arrival, John decided it was time to test his theory about the collector's technology. During the morning observation period, as the aliens clustered near the door with their devices, he deliberately walked close to the energy barrier that sealed their cell. The response was immediate. Alarms began blaring throughout the facility, the blue light strobing frantically, and the collectors scrambled backward in obvious panic. But most importantly, John caught what he'd been looking for, a momentary fluctuation in the energy field when the security protocols activated. "Did you see that?" he asked Vermithrax quietly as the alarms died down. The copper dragon's eyes glowed with understanding. The barrier destabilized for 2.3 seconds during the alert sequence. "Long enough," John confirmed. "But we'll only get one chance." That evening, as they gathered around their meager rations, John outlined the escape plan in whispered tones. It was audacious, dangerous, and relied on split-second timing. It was also their only shot at freedom. "The key is the cascade failure," he explained, using a piece of charcoal from the feeding area to sketch diagrams on the stone floor. "Their entire security system is interconnected. If we can overload one component, it should create a domino effect." Safra studied the crude blueprint with intelligent eyes. "You want us to trigger every alarm simultaneously?" "Exactly. Fire alarms, containment breaches, power fluctuations, everything at once. Their automated systems won't be able to prioritize responses." Draxus flexed his claws. "And while they're dealing with chaos, we walk out the front door," John finished. "Gulthex, you're the key to this. Your collar is newer, which means it's running on a different frequency than the others." The black dragon's head tilted. "How does that help us?" "Because when you roar at maximum volume, the harmonic resonance should interfere with the older collars. It won't shut them down completely, but it might give you enough of your natural abilities back to start some real fires." Vermithrax chuckled, a sound like distant thunder. "Literal fires. I like this plan." "There's more," John continued, his voice dropping even lower. "I've been watching their patrol schedules. Every 3 days, they rotate their security teams. Tomorrow is rotation day, which means minimal staff and maximum confusion during shift change." "When do we move?" Gulthex asked, and John was gratified to hear genuine respect in the dragon's voice. "Tomorrow, during evening feeding. The moment that wall opens, we execute." The next day passed with agonizing slowness. The dragons maintained their usual routines, but John could sense the tension building. He spent the time making final preparations, wrapping additional fabric around his weapon grip and mentally rehearsing every step of their plan. As evening approached, John positioned himself near the feeding wall while the dragons took their designated spots throughout the cell. To any observer, they appeared to be following their normal routine. The wall began to slide open with its familiar hum. "Now," John whispered. Gulthex reared up and released a roar that shook dust from the ceiling. The sound wasn't just loud, it was primal, the voice of an apex predator unleashed. Immediately, the other dragon's collars began sparking and fluctuating. Vermithrax felt his fire return first. He exhaled a stream of flame directly at the surveillance devices on the ceiling, melting them to slag. Safra followed suit, targeting the environmental controls. Draxus, his collar completely overloaded, blasted the feeding mechanism with enough heat to melt the metal. Alarms shrieked throughout the facility. Emergency lights bathed everything in red. The collectors' voices could be heard over intercoms, speaking rapidly in their clicking language. "Phase 2, John shouted over the chaos. He sprinted toward the main door, jamming his improvised weapon into the energy barrier just as it destabilized from the overloaded security protocols. Sparks flew, the smell of ozone filled the air, and for a critical moment, the barrier flickered. That was all the dragons needed. Gulthex, his full power restored as his collar finally shorted out completely, breathed fire directly into the door mechanism. The alien metal buckled and warped under temperatures that could melt steel. Vermithrax and Safra added their flames, creating an inferno that no terrestrial material could withstand. The massive door exploded outward. Move! John yelled, and 4 apex predators burst through the opening like a force of nature. The corridor beyond was chaos. Collectors scattered in all directions, their clicking voices raised in panic. Emergency systems battled each other for priority, creating a cacophony of alarms and flashing lights. Automated fire suppression systems triggered, filling the air with foam that only made visibility worse. Which way? Draxus roared over the noise. John had been studying the facility's layout during their captivity, noting the direction of air currents and the sound patterns of the collector's movements. Left, then up. The hangar bay should be 3 levels above us. They moved through the corridors like a force of nature. The dragon's natural weapons had returned in full, and years of suppressed fury powered their advance. Blast doors sealed automatically in their path, only to be melted through in seconds. Security drones deployed from the walls, only to be swatted aside like insects. The collectors had built their facility to contain individual specimens, not a coordinated assault by 4 of the most dangerous creatures in their collection. They reached the hangar bay to find it in complete chaos. Automated systems were attempting to launch every spacecraft simultaneously while emergency protocols tried to seal all exits. The result was a traffic jam of alien vessels trying to escape through doorways that kept opening and closing randomly. There, John pointed to a smaller craft near the edge of the bay. That one looks like a scout ship. Fast, maneuverable, and big enough for all of us. Can you fly it? Safra asked as they raced across the hangar. I can fly anything, John replied with more confidence than he felt. The controls might be alien, but the physics are universal. They reached the ship just as a squad of collector security forces entered the hangar. These aliens were different, taller, armed with energy weapons, and clearly trained for combat. They opened fire immediately, sending bolts of crackling energy across the bay. Get to the ship, Vermithrax roared, spreading his wings to shield the others. We'll handle this. The 3 dragons turned to face their former captors, and for a moment, John felt almost sorry for the aliens. Almost. Dragon fire met energy weapons in a battle that lit up the hangar like a miniature sun. The collector's technology was advanced, but it wasn't designed to fight creatures that could melt their weapons with a breath and move faster than their targeting systems could track. John reached the scout ship and began frantically examining the control panel. Alien symbols covered every surface, but the basic layout was familiar: thrust controls, navigation, life support. He'd flown captured enemy aircraft before, the principle was the same. The engine spun up with a whine that cut through even the sounds of battle. Everyone aboard, he shouted. The dragons finished their work, the security squad was either fled or unconscious, and squeezed into the scout ship with considerable difficulty. Dragon anatomy wasn't designed for spacecraft seating. Hold on, John warned, and engaged the thrusters. The ship shot out of the hangar like a bullet, leaving the collector facility shrinking behind them. Space opened up around them, vast and star-filled and beautifully, impossibly free. Where to now? Gulfex asked, his voice filled with something John had never heard from the Black Dragon before: respect. John studied the navigation display, noting the various star systems marked on the alien charts. Somewhere out there were their home worlds, their families, their lives before captivity. Anywhere but here, he replied, setting course for the nearest inhabited system. We've got a universe to explore and a debt to repay. Behind them, the collector facility continued to burn, its carefully controlled experiments reduced to chaos by the alliance of species they never saw coming. The specimens had become the hunters, and the galaxy would never be the same. Part 5, Freedom's Price. 3 months after their escape, John Carter stood on the observation deck of the Dragon's Breath, the name they'd given their stolen scout ship, watching the stars whirl past. They'd covered thousands of light years since fleeing the collector facility, visiting 7 different star systems and establishing contact with 3 previously unknown civilizations. The ship had been modified extensively. What started as a cramped scout vessel had been transformed into something entirely unique, part exploration ship, part mobile fortress, part home for the strangest crew in the galaxy. Picking up another distress signal, Saphira called from the navigation station. Her massive form had been fitted with a custom interface that allowed her to operate the alien technology with surprising delicacy. "It's coming from the Vega system, about 2 days away." John made his way to the bridge, where Vermithrax was studying tactical displays with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. The Copper Dragon had proven to have an exceptional mind for strategy, and had become their unofficial military commander. "Another collector ship?" John asked. "Definitely," Vermithrax confirmed. "Same energy signature, same communication patterns. But this one's bigger than the others we've encountered." Draxus looked up from the weapons console where he'd been calibrating their arsenal. "How much bigger?" "Mothership class," Vermithrax replied grimly. "Probably carrying hundreds of specimens." John felt the familiar fire ignite in his chest. Over the past 3 months, they'd liberated 17 collector facilities, freeing everything from sentient crystals to space-dwelling leviathans. Each rescue had been dangerous, but also deeply satisfying. They were evening the score for every being who'd ever been caged for alien amusement. "Gulfex, what's our operational status?" John called to the Black Dragon, who had become their chief engineer through a combination of natural cunning and draconic stubbornness. "All systems optimal," Gulfex reported. "The new shield generators are online, and I've been making improvements to the fire suppression systems. We're ready for anything they can throw at us." John nodded, feeling the familiar pre-mission tension building. Each facility they hit taught them more about collector technology and tactics. They'd evolved from desperate escapees to something far more dangerous, a precision strike team with the firepower of gods and the cunning of apex predators. "Set course for Vega," he ordered. "And start monitoring their communications. I want to know everything about this facility before we arrive." The journey to Vega gave them time to prepare. They'd learned that collector motherships were essentially mobile cities, housing thousands of aliens and containing dozens of different specimen environments. Breaking into one wouldn't be like their previous raids, it would be war. But they'd also learned something else during their months of freedom. The collector empire was vast but not invincible. Each facility they destroyed sent ripples through the alien network, forcing them to divert resources to security and leaving other operations vulnerable. They were making a difference. "Incoming transmission," Saphira announced as they dropped out of hyperspace near Vega. "It's not from the collectors." The main screen flickered to life, revealing a figure that made John's breath catch. It was humanoid but clearly not human, tall, graceful, with skin that seemed to shift between silver and blue. But it was the eyes that held his attention. Ancient, intelligent, and filled with desperate hope. "Unknown vessel," the being said in accented but understandable English, "I am Ambassador Thyron of the Vegan Collective. We detected your approach and, we need to speak with you immediately." John exchanged glances with the dragons. This was unexpected. Put him through, John decided. The ambassador's image stabilized, and John could see the bridge of an alien ship behind him. But it wasn't collector technology, this was something else entirely. "You are the ones they call the Liberators," Thyron said, and it wasn't a question. "The mixed crew that has been attacking collector facilities across the sector." "We prefer to think of ourselves as evening the score," John replied carefully. "What do you want, Ambassador?" "To offer you an alliance," Thyron said immediately. "And to warn you that the collector mothership you're approaching isn't just a prison, it's a trap. They know you're coming." The bridge fell silent except for the hum of the ship's systems. John felt ice form in his stomach. "Explain," Vermithrax rumbled. "The collectors have been studying your methods," Thyron continued. "This mothership is bait, designed to lure you into a confrontation they can control. They've been tracking your ship, learning your capabilities, preparing countermeasures." "And you know this how?" Draxus asked suspiciously. "Because my people have been fighting the collectors for 300 years, Thyron replied. "We've lost entire worlds to their raids, but we've also learned how they think. They never encountered anything like your crew before, specimens that not only escaped but began systematically destroying their operations. John processed this information quickly. An enemy that adapted was more dangerous than one that simply reacted. What kind of trap are we looking at? He asked. The mothership is heavily defended, but that's not the real danger, Byron explained. They've filled it with specimens specifically chosen to counter your abilities. Creatures immune to fire, beings that feed on energy, predators that hunt in packs. They want you to board that ship. Golthex's laugh was bitter. Let them try. We've faced worse odds. Have you? Byron asked quietly. Have you faced an entire ship designed specifically to kill you, crewed by beings who've studied every move you've made for 3 months? The question hung in the air like smoke. John had to admit the ambassador had a point. They'd grown confident, perhaps overconfident, in their abilities. So what do you propose? Safra asked. A joint operation, Byron replied. My fleet has been tracking this mothership for weeks. We know its weak points, its patrol schedules, its defensive capabilities. But we lack the firepower to breach their hull. You have that firepower, but you lack the intelligence to avoid their traps. John considered the offer. Everything in his military training told him to be suspicious of last-minute allies offering convenient solutions. But everything in his experience told him that the collectors were learning, adapting, becoming more dangerous. Show us your intelligence, he decided. If it's good, we'll consider a partnership. What followed was a 3-hour briefing that changed everything John thought he knew about the Collector Empire. Thyron's people had been fighting a shadow war for centuries, gradually piecing together the aliens' true purpose. They're not just collecting specimens for study, Byron explained as holographic displays showed collector fleet movements across dozens of star systems. They're building something. A massive project that requires genetic material from thousands of species. Building what? Vermithrax asked. We don't know, Byron admitted. But every specimen they take, every world they raid, brings them closer to completion. And based on our calculations, they're almost finished. The implications were staggering. John realized they hadn't just been rescuing individual prisoners, they'd been disrupting some kind of galactic construction project. The mothership contains specimens from over 200 worlds, Byron continued. Including some species that were thought extinct. If we can liberate it, we deal a major blow to their entire operation, John finished. All right, Ambassador. You've got our attention. What's the plan? The assault on the Collector mothership began at dawn, Vega time. Thyron's fleet, a dozen ships of various sizes and configurations, approached from the outer system while the Dragon's Breath came in fast and low, using the system's asteroid field for cover. The mothership was massive, easily 10 times the size of any collector vessel they'd encountered. Its hull bristled with weapons, and energy shields shimmered around its perimeter like soap bubbles made of lightning. Remember, John said over the comm as they approached their insertion point, this isn't a rescue mission. This is war. The collectors know we're coming, so expect heavy resistance. The first phase went exactly as planned. Thyron's fleet engaged the mothership's escort vessels, drawing attention away from the main target. Meanwhile, the Dragon's Breath slipped through the defensive perimeter and latched onto the mothership's hull like a parasite. Cutting through now, Golthex reported, his fire burning through alien metal like a torch through paper. They breached the hull and poured into the mothership's corridors. But instead of the panicked collectors they'd encountered before, they found organized resistance. Armed guards in powered armor, automated defense systems, and corridor after corridor designed to channel intruders into kill zones. They'd been planning this for a while, Draxus growled as he melted through a blast door that had tried to trap them. Then we changed the plan, John replied, checking his improvised weapon. Over the months, it had evolved from a simple metal rod into something approaching a work of art, a custom blade forged in dragon fire and tempered in the vacuum of space. Instead of fighting through the corridors as the collectors expected, they went up. Dragon claws and fire made short work of deck plating, allowing them to bypass entire defensive networks by creating their own route through the ship. The first specimen bay they reached contained creatures John couldn't have imagined in his worst nightmares. Things with too many eyes, beings made of living shadow, predators that existed in dimensions he couldn't perceive. But they were all caged, all suffering, all waiting for rescue. "These aren't specimens," Saphra breathed as she examined the containment systems. "These are weapons. Living weapons. The collectors are going to use them," Vermithrax realized. "Turn them loose on worlds that resist collection." John felt anger burn in his chest. It wasn't enough for the aliens to steal beings from their homes, they were planning to turn them into instruments of conquest. "Not today," he said grimly. "Free them all." What followed was controlled chaos. As the dragons melted through containment systems, John worked on the electronic locks using techniques learned from dozens of liberation missions. Creatures poured out of their cages, some fleeing toward escape pods, others turning on their former captors with centuries of suppressed rage. The collector guards found themselves fighting a three-way battle against dragons, liberated specimens, and their own security systems. The mothership's corridors became a maze of fire, energy beams, and alien roars. "John!" Saphra's voice cut through the chaos. "I found something. You need to see this." She led him to a heavily shielded chamber deep in the ship's core. Inside, behind walls of transparent aluminum, was a creature unlike anything John had ever seen. It was humanoid but wrong, as if someone had tried to combine features from a dozen different species into a single being. "It's a hybrid," John realized. "They're trying to create a perfect specimen." "Not just one," Saphra corrected, gesturing to dozens of similar chambers. "An entire army of them." The scope of the collector's plan finally became clear. They weren't just studying species, they were combining them, creating new life forms with the best attributes of hundreds of worlds. Super soldiers for a galactic conquest that would make their current raids look like minor skirmishes. "Golfex." John called over the comm, "I need you down here. We're going to need a lot of fire." The black dragon arrived with Vermithrax and Draxus close behind. When they saw the hybrid chambers, their reaction was immediate and violent. "Abomination," Vermithrax snarled. "We end this now," Golfex agreed. Dragon fire filled the chamber, temperatures reaching levels that would have vaporized most materials. The hybrid creatures never had a chance to wake up as their artificial wombs became funeral pyres. Alarms screamed throughout the mothership as its primary project literally went up in smoke. Emergency systems battled the flames while automated voices announced hull breaches, system failures, and containment losses in dozens of languages. "Time to go," John announced as structural supports began failing around them. They fought their way back to the dragon's breath through corridors filled with smoke, liberated specimens, and increasingly desperate collector resistance. The mothership was dying around them, its vast bulk beginning to break apart under the strain of internal explosions and system failures. As they cleared the mothership's hull, John looked back to see Thyron's fleet finishing off the last of the escort vessels. The ambassador's voice crackled over the comm. "Magnificent work, Liberators. The Collector Empire just lost 20 years of research and development." "It's not enough," John replied as he watched the mothership's death throes. "There are more facilities, more ships, more specimens suffering in cages across the galaxy." "Then we keep fighting," Vermithrax said simply. "Until they're all free." John nodded, feeling the weight of purpose settle on his shoulders. He'd started this journey as a prisoner, a specimen in an alien zoo. But somewhere along the way, he'd become something else entirely. A liberator. A leader. A symbol of hope for every being that had ever been caged. The dragon's breath turned away from the dying mothership and set course for the next system, the next battle, the next chance to make a difference. Behind them, escape pods filled with freed specimens scattered across the galaxy, carrying word of the impossible alliance that had given them hope. A human and 4 dragons, united by shared captivity, bound by mutual respect, and dedicated to a simple principle, that no intelligent being should ever be caged for another's amusement. They called themselves the Liberators, and across the galaxy, their legend grew. Collector facilities reported increasing resistance. Specimen raids failed as intended victims fought back with knowledge gained from rescued prisoners. The empire built on suffering and exploitation began to crack under pressure from beings they had never considered a threat. John Carter had learned many things during his time in the collector's cell. He'd learned that survival was about more than just staying alive, it was about maintaining hope, dignity, and the will to fight back. He'd learned that the strongest alliances could form between the most unlikely partners. And he'd learned that sometimes, the specimen becomes the predator. But most importantly, he'd learned that freedom wasn't something you won once and kept forever. It was something you fought for every day, for yourself and for others who couldn't fight for themselves. As the dragon's breath jumped to hyperspace, beginning another chapter in their ongoing war against the Collector Empire, John allowed himself a small smile. The aliens had made a critical error when they threw a human special forces operative into a cage with dragons. They'd created their own worst nightmare. And that nightmare was just getting started. The end.